And I think we need to reflect very much on what was said in respect to the reality of what's happening now around the world, the reality of what's happening to victims. And when I look at how this has happened and how the situation has got worse, we need to reflect that we are the current incumbents of this world, and it's up to us to decide what course we take. And if we take the words of Pope Francis, he sums it up, as he does on so many things, in a very succinct way. The world feeds upon the powerless. Too many people are treated as consumer goods to be used and discarded. That is how the Pope sums this up, that we are using people, us. And we may think we're disconnected from that, but as I will talk about here, we are connected very much with this. And I've been working very much with the Santa Marta Group, which is a group that works on bringing together statutory agencies, non-statutory agencies. It was started with the support of Bishop Sanchez Sorondo in the Vatican Pontifical Academy, where he was Chancellor. And it brings together in particular law enforcement, but also government agencies, non-government organisations, and this is working around the world and is trying to influence policy. But this is sometimes the policy that is when the fire's happened. When the problem has happened, if you need the police, if you need support services, something's gone wrong. And wouldn't it be better if we were working on preventing? And so much of our resource, quite rightly, is supporting victims. Absolutely, 100% I'm behind that. And I work with many projects around the world that do that. But we're chasing the fires. Where's the fire prevention? Where is the model that makes sure this doesn't happen? Where do you start to fear even committing one of these crimes? And how do we turn it back that we respect people for who they are and give them the opportunities they deserve? The people that Annie has spoken about, all of those situations could have been prevented, or at least more done to prevent it. And in fact, as we heard from Annie, the current situation here in the UK in particular has made it more likely that somebody will be a victim of trafficking by the very legislation created in the United Kingdom. And we should never shy away from that or speaking about that. But very often we do. We look at the niceties as opposed to the realities. And he spoke about the amount of people. So it's 50 million people around the world. This makes this one of the biggest issues on the planet. And it's all connected to business, it's all connected to supply chains, it's all connected to a demand for some sort of service. It's all connected to the fact that we want cheap labour. So nothing has changed from the slavery of the old days, which was about cheap or free labour or cheap goods, to now. Or the requirement to have some service, sexual service, some sort of entertainment, something where we have a power over somebody who's less capable or less privileged or has had no opportunity. And we exploit that. And we need to start looking at how we can prevent that from happening. The global benefits of modern slavery is 236 billion annually. This makes this the second most profitable crime on the planet. About 500 billion in the drugs industry of illegal drugs, 120 billion in arms dealing, illegal arms dealing. So this is 236 billion that is slushing around out there, about the size of the economy of Portugal. That's how big this is. Yet, we think, or perhaps we do things that we can change this tide with just small campaigns, with just small actions. Well, these criminals are operating with impunity. And the criminals are sometimes wearing white collars, sit in C-suites, sit in businesses. And it's hard to talk about that as a criminal But if it was corruption, terrorism, or any other serious crime, we would have no holdback on calling it criminal activity. And the people who were profiting from it would face the sanction of a crime. And some people have told me that, who are in positions, very senior positions in big companies, that if something came into their business and it was connected to terrorism or corruption, a whole process would be kicked in because they have reporting duties. They have to make sure that something happens because otherwise it's them who face the sanction. But when it comes to human trafficking, just hold your nose and let it pass until the smell's gone. And that may include hundreds of millions in revenue that's passing through your business. And investors, for example, do investors, even Christian investors, even those that invest in from faith backgrounds, do they know where their investments are going? Are pensions plans, are these big investment pots featuring and making money out of the back of the people like in the DRC, the young boys and the young girls working down the mines? And of course, it's about money. And when we look at this as a crime, 236 billion every year. The other figures, 50 million people. But 22,000 children die in labour exploitation every year. We have no clue about how many adults die. So 22,000 children is 116 Boeing 737s full. When 2 Boeing 737s crashed, the whole fleet was grounded. It cost Boeing billions. The CEO was fired. The company was under investigation. Boeing 737 MAX didn't take off for nearly 3 years. Holidays had to be cancelled because 2 crashed with 300 people on board. But yet 22,000 children dying in corporate supply chains. Nobody loses their job. Nobody gets sanctioned. There may be a civil action, but it continues and continues. And Pope Francis calls this money blood money. And we need to say things like, this is blood money, this is serious crime. And if you are in a big business and you are not addressing this and taking this out of your supply chain and making sure the efforts of your company are not preventing this, then you are in the game of human trafficking. You are in the game of criminality. And there can be no two options. You can't be kind of against it. You're either in it or you're against it. And we've had a Palermo Protocol since 2000. So next year it is 25 years old. And as we heard from Raza, we're 25 years down this journey. And we're also a long way down the Sustainable Development Goals, halfway through them. And yet things are getting worse. And yet, as a former police officer, prior to the Modern Slavery Act in the UK, my own team were getting far more prosecutions than the whole of Europe now. Far more convictions than the whole of Europe. And we didn't have a Modern Slavery Act. But what we did have was dedication, teams that work with victims, respecting individuals, and we used the measures available to law enforcement under counter-terrorist laws, as in surveillance, looking at money, looking at crime trends, working with airlines, getting trends of tickets being booked, looking at all that information, that data, and then pinpointing where our opportunities are. Now the solution might be we do a campaign. We go to a local area. We drive a bus around. We have highlights of this. None of that is bad. But if you're a criminal, and when I did my first speech in the Vatican, I said, these criminals involved in these crimes, they don't care what I said as a police chief. They don't care what the Prime Minister says of the United Kingdom. They don't care what Pope Francis says. But they do feel quite emotional when they get arrested, locked up, and their assets are seized. And I've seen the victims really see that as a part of their solution and a part of their rebuilding. And when you can get them compensation, and you can build them a new life as well. That, for me, was an outcome worth celebrating and recognising. I was told I would never ever get compensation for an Indian woman who was trafficked into the UK, amongst others. And I was told I would never get a conviction. I set up a courtroom in Hyderabad, in India, linked to the Old Bailey. Yes, it was difficult. Yes, I could smell the corruption in the police in India, but I still did it. And when we got the conviction of all the traffickers who were living in very exclusive houses, the woman had been sold and other women had been sold, and when she got a very large-scale compensation after her traffickers went to prison for 15 years, she actually said to me, this journey was worth it, when her family were reunited to her here in the UK and brought from India. I'm not sure the UK law would allow that now. So let's not talk about progress when things are going backwards. And of course, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals. This gives us our targets. And 8.7 we speak about, and Annie spoke of. And it's about taking immediate and effective measures. Immediate and effective. This was in 2015. There's been nothing immediate and effective. But that immediate and effective is also mentioned in the 1930 Labour Convention, Forced Labour Convention, in the 1957 Forced Labour Convention, in the 2014 Forced Labour Convention. It is also mentioned in about 70 other conventions of the ILO. Immediate and effective measures. Well, we're failing on all those conventions that are signed up by many, many countries. And when we are talking at different events and trying to build up measures, the people who are in trafficking, the people who are exploited, want us to take immediate and effective measures. And of course, we promised that we would end child soldiers and the worst forms of child labour by 2025. So we've got, what, 6 months left? Not sure that's going to happen. And I'm not sure we're any closer to it. So we need to really reflect on what we're doing and how can we shape this. And there's a program that I designed, a strategy with Santa Marta Group, which is taking a completely different approach. We need to see government procurement and business culture change. Governments buy 20% of the world's goods are purchased by governments. And the United States government is a major contributor to that. They have got the control over what they buy and what they don't buy. And that will start to change things. If you can't get a deal with the US government and you're a big supplier, it's very difficult to survive. And they have Customs and Border Protection. There are 52 orders under the Customs and Border Protection in place now. When the last ones were put in place, for example, in Uzbekistan, about the cotton trade, the US government asked me if I'd be part of a delegation to go and look at Uzbekistan. In 6 months, they turned it around to take away the forced labour and the child labour so they could get their trade back with the US. So these sanctions, albeit this was a sanction whereby you couldn't trade, can have incredible effects. And of course, business. If you've got a business and it's got trafficking in the supply chain, it's simple. You haven't got a business. You've got a crime group. We should be talking about it like that. If you say, I cannot check my supply chain because it's complex, well, you're covering up. And we need to start making those responsible, those who are benefiting, accountable. And that's why number 2 that I introduced is tainted money. Money that is made from trafficking, even if it's made and it's not what we call proceeds of crime, but the tainted money. For example, an operation here in the United Kingdom looked at supermarkets who were being supplied with goods that came from the United Kingdom in the agricultural sector. The traffickers were identified, the victims were identified and supported. But the big supermarkets, which were all the household names, no sanction. They didn't even lose the profit that they made out of those goods that only came from 30 miles from their distribution centres. They didn't come from Southeast Asia or Latin America. It was 30 miles away. So let's start to look at how we make accountability through tainted money. And the digital space must be governed by law. We're seeing a move to that. We're seeing a move more with the EU. And of course, we need international instruments to be understood. What do these international instruments say, and how can we use the institutions? The international criminal courts have only issued one warrant ever for human trafficking, and that was last year. And on that is the name Vladimir Putin, for trafficking children from Ukraine. But before that, there was none. Why are we not using these institutions properly to actually raise this to the level that it needs to be? A crime that's generating 236 billion every year, that is actually destabilizing economies, national security and international safety. But it's all done on the basis of the victimization and the exploitation of human beings. And this is where GSN and other organizations can show their moral leadership, to actually say, we are not going to tolerate, and we're going to work to identify and address these norms that have been created into society. So I'm working with the G20, and this is actually the mandate of this year's G20 in Brazil: sustained, inclusive and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment and decent work for all. That falls straight into this room. That is what the G20 is trying to do as one of its priorities. And the US and Brazil and a number of other countries are pushing this agenda. So this is where we can be operating. And what I want to see, and what I'm campaigning for, and with the support of some governments, is by 2030, $30 billion is invested every year by the G20 countries. They've done this before in other projects, and 30 billion is a small amount of money, really, against 236 billion. But it's a lot of money against not even 1 billion. So that we can start to have proper systems in place. We can have sustainable funding. We can have prevention integrated into government policy, business accountability and sanction, action plans for multiple years, forced labour in different sectors such as fishing, and adhering to existing standards, better use of the customs and border legislation, full implementation of the new EU directive on supply chains, which will have a sanction, which only came in a couple of months ago. And evidence, if we see this, we should be starting to see an evidence in the decline of the prevalence of human trafficking. So what we need to do is to be pushing this to the top of the agenda, right onto the tongues of leaders at the G20. Since 2018, human trafficking, modern slavery, child labour, or some other form of it has been included in the G20 declarations at the Leaders Summit. But now we need that turned into a policy of delivery. And that's what we need to work on, particularly attached to the SDGs. We're not going to achieve many and most of the SDGs, but if we can get to 2030, and we get to a point where we've got the cycle of human trafficking, the economic norms, the socio-economic structures that allow it to exist, if we're starting to break that circle, then we can start to see its collapse. Start to see it as something that's no longer acceptable within business, within the high streets. I just want to tell you, here in the UK, there are 40,000 women and men and boys and girls waiting for decisions in the NRM. And the average time they wait is 2 years. Can you imagine if you went to a police station or the authorities and said you'd been burgled, or your house had been, your car had been stolen, and the police said, we'll come back to you in 2 years. And actually, because you're not in the country legally, we're going to deport you. Can you imagine if that happened to a rape victim? Can you imagine if that happened to a domestic violence victim? These are crimes that hold life imprisonment in the UK. These are crimes where people have been turned into a commodity. And Annie spoke of the disincentive to come forward as a victim because of new legislation. There's one other thing that new legislation has done. It's created a charter for the criminals. It's created more impunity. So I see and have met many of the people that Annie speaks of, whether it's the girls I've met in Italy, the women I've met in Nigeria, people I've met in Latin America or in Southeast Asia. And one thing they always say to me is, can you get people to stop doing this? That's as much as they want, particularly the mothers and the fathers whose children have gone and suffered and sometimes lost their lives. But we need to think about 22,000 children that died last year. And the world isn't even committing $1 billion to fight that. More is spent on painting one aircraft carrier or protecting a dignitary than is spent by a whole nation on fighting human trafficking. The Home Office disclosed its budget that it spent on the last 9 years in human trafficking in its most recent report, and it's £40 million, a country that says it's leading the fight. There's more money spent on protecting ministers, or a few ministers, in that period of time. When you reflect on it, are we really serious? And that's why I think organisations like GSN, we need to look at the policy. We need to take the policy to the highest level, not forgetting what's going on at the grassroots. That still needs to happen. We need to be doing this so that we can elevate the support that's there to victims. So we move from people running out with the fire engines to actually, hopefully, at some point, not requiring the fire engines at all. So thank you very much.